This is the ongoing series in which I attempt to work through the entire Game Boy library, 3 games at a time. In each episode, I'll talk about one game that I like and one that I don't. And finally, a third mystery game that might be good or it might be bad. The only thing I can say for sure is that it will certainly be Game Boy. This is the good, the bad, and the Game Boy. In a time when all developers, Nintendo included, were trying to figure out how to replicate their popular NES titles as Game Boy games, with varying degrees of success, Capcom had the foresight to look several years into the future at Digital Eclipse's Game Boy port of Ghosts 'n Goblins and say, maybe we better not. So instead of creating a potentially less playable version of a game that many kids at the time probably already hated, Capcom's solution was to develop a tandem adventure game set in the same universe as Ghosts 'n Goblins and focused exclusively on one of the main reasons why so many people found those original games so infuriating in the first place. The game I'm referring to, of course, is Gargoyle's Quest, which is not only my favorite game on the Game Boy, but also one of my favorite games of all time. And it also happens to be a great game to talk about around Halloween. Boiled down to its most basic components, Gargoyle's Quest is an action platformer with an extremely thin and arguably unnecessary coating of RPG elements sprinkled on top. More on those a bit later. This is one of the earliest games I remember where you played as the bad guy. The quote-unquote hero of the story is Firebrand, one of the Red Devils from the Ghosts 'n Goblins games. There aren't many video game characters quite like Firebrand, even though he himself is basically an amalgam of every video game character up to that point. He runs and shoots like Mega Man, he can cling to walls like Ryu from Ninja Gaiden, and he can use his wings to temporarily fly and hover like Peach from Mario 2. As you progress through the game, Firebrand will become steadily more powerful. He finds armor to add more hit points to his life bar, and increasingly stronger wings to fly for longer periods of time. The ultimate irony of the game is that as you complete Firebrand's quest, which is revealed at the end to be kind of a prequel to the Ghosts 'n Goblins series, the game has made you complicit in creating one of the most hated video game enemies of all time. The other inhabitants of this world, the same zombies and demons that plague Arthur in the main series, are Firebrand's friends and comrades. Other familiar characters from the G&G series appear here as well, like King Roosevelt, who may have been the ultimate evil from Arthur's perspective, but to Firebrand, he's a respected leader and ally. Side note, Roosevelt is the English spelling of Lucifer. Now, I don't know if that was a bit of mistranslation or a deliberate misspelling, but in either case, I thought it was pretty cute when I found that out. Gargoyle's Quest is not an especially long game, but it feels much bigger than it really is because of those RPG elements I mentioned earlier. There's only about half a dozen full action stages in the game, but a large percentage of the adventure is spent traveling across a Dragon Warrior-esque overworld map to move from one stage to the next. At the end of the day, it's still a rigidly linear experience, but the overworld does a pretty good job at making a fairly run-of-the-mill action game feel like a sprawling adventure game, even if half the experience is basically just padding. You'll encounter a number of towns as you move across the map, and here you can purchase items, receive passwords to save your progress, and engage in a number of mostly pointless conversations with the game's NPCs. Overall, Gargoyle's Quest is a fantastic game with excellent graphics and music and really fun and interesting play mechanics. However, I'm not going to try to say it's a perfect game, so I guess we're going to end this on something of a sour note. The game's difficulty doesn't scale up quite as quickly as Firebrand himself powers up, resulting in kind of a weird, inverted difficulty scale. This ends up being at odds with some of the RPG elements that they insisted on putting in the game. Specifically, I'm referring to the random encounters in the overworld map. In typical RPG fashion, as you work your way across the overworld, you are constantly interrupted by random battle encounters. The only thing you get out of these encounters are vials, which are the game's currency for buying items in the towns. However, the only thing you are ever able to buy are extra lives. Because the game generally gets easier as you go, by the time you reach the game's halfway point, the need for extra lives, and by extension, for vials, has dropped off almost completely. but the random encounters continue at the same rate all the way through the game, and that's annoying. As the series continued on the NES and Super Nintendo, they did clean up this RPG stuff quite a bit and streamlined the experience. However, each of the game's sequels have their own set of problems, I think, which is why, in my opinion, Gargoyle's Quest is still the best in the trilogy, one of the very best games on the Game Boy, and certainly one of the best games you could play for Halloween. So having committed to at least trying to review every Game Boy game that came out in the United States, I'm kind of resigned to playing a lot of games that I otherwise would have had the good sense to just skip over entirely. Which brings us to Casper. This game is of course based on the movie of the same name that came out sometime in the 90s. I never liked the movie, and I wouldn't expect the game to be that much better, except, plot twist, Natsume was associated with this game. That alone is likely enough to get a few people like myself to give the game a second look, because we'll just go ahead and name a bad Natsume game. I'll wait. Plot twist. This game is only published by Natsume. The actual developer was, you know what, it really doesn't matter, because as it turns out, this game is so bad that I really don't think they deserve to be mentioned by name. The instruction manual assures us that the game is, and I quote, so much fun, it's scary. Well, they're half right, I guess. Casper the game seems to follow the events towards the end of Casper the movie, when Christina Ricci's dad has been turned into a ghost, and there's some kind of cockamamie science machine that can bring him back to life. The game is basically a series of extremely shitty mini-games, where you have to collect enough ooze to activate the machine. There's no sense in going into a whole lot of detail about these mini-games because every single one of them can be summed up as just like that other game, except ghosts. One is Missile Command, with ghosts. Another one is Load Runner, with ghosts. You'll probably recognize another one as that Firefighter Game & Watch game, or the Marshmallow level from Earthworm Jim 2, except, and get this time there's ghosts in it. And don't make the mistake of thinking that the fun you had in Missile Command and Load Runner and that Earthworm Jim Marshmallow level will in any way carry over to the fun you're going to have in this game, because it's not going to. These games all play terribly. And that brings us to the fourth minigame. Now I'm just smart enough to recognize the setup for a Rube Goldberg machine, but clearly I'm not quite smart enough to deduce what the game is wanting me to do here. It's pretty clear that you're supposed to assemble the machine by placing the appropriate items along the track, but these graphics are so terrible that I can't even tell what these objects are, let alone predict what action they're gonna have. So here's how you play this game. I actually had to look this up because it is weirdly obtuse. You place an object where you think it might go, and then you pull up this screen, which will give you a description about what these objects, oh, it's a chicken? Yeah, I would not have guessed that, looks like a duck. And down here it tells you how many objects have been placed correctly. If that number doesn't go up after you place an object, you press select to reset the whole screen, and you start over from scratch. Through this mind-numbing process of trial and error, you'll eventually get all the items correctly placed, and then you'll get to watch the machine slowly perform its animation. Once you finish all 4 minigames, you have completed that level, and then you move on to the next one, which is the same as the first, except a little harder. After that, you move on to the next level, which again is the same as the first, except even harder. There are 3 sets of these minigames, and the only real difference between them is the Rube Goldberg puzzle, which is unique to each level. And you might be saying, hey, what do you expect from a game targeted at kids? As if being a kids game is any excuse for it being utter garbage. But really, is it for kids? Because these minigames all control so badly that I can't imagine kids being able to complete 3 levels of this. And that's to say nothing of the fact that the game is just simply not fun to play. So I guess in that regard, it's doing a pretty good job at representing the movie. Now here's a fun fact. Gargoyle's Quest was the first game Capcom released on the Game Boy. Konami's first Game Boy game, at least here in the United States, was Castlevania Adventure. Now, Castlevania Adventure is a bit of a divisive game, but it's easy to disparage the game when we have the benefit of looking back at the Castlevania series in its entirety, from its highs, of which there were a staggering number, to its lows, which were mercifully few but no less soul-crushing. Clearly, Castlevania Adventure is going to look bad when you compare it to Castlevania 3 or Symphony of the Night, but at the time, the only games we had to compare it to in the US were Castlevania 1 and 2. It goes without saying that Adventure falls to pieces when compared to the original Castlevania, but compared to Castlevania 2? Yeah, that's a tough call. Let me think about that. There are a bunch of reasons why people don't like this game. For one, it's incredibly slow. Now, there was likely a reason for this. They were probably just doing everything they could to reduce the motion blur. But no matter how reasonable the explanation, Castlevania Adventure is noticeably sluggish. Also, Castlevania Adventure is really weird. This game is like an AI interpretation of the Castlevania series as described by Sloth from The Goonies. And he doesn't know anything about Castlevania. It's a bizarro universe where all the staircases have been replaced by ropes, and instead of skeletons and Medusa heads, the stages are filled with giant rolling eyeballs and creepy somersaulting caterpillars, and I don't know, whatever the hell these things are. It's a strange world where hearts refill your health instead of charging your sub-weapons, because there are no sub-weapons, or wall meat for that matter. In fact, the only recognizable elements from the NES Castlevania games are the Belmont's character and Dracula. And that's assuming you can even make it far enough in the game to see Dracula, because the other thing people hate about this game is that it is relentlessly punishing. Just like the original Castlevania, you can power up your whip twice to extend your reach and the damage you inflict. The third power level even shoots a little fireball from the end of your whip. That's pretty cool. But unlike the original Castlevania, taking any damage at all will kick you back down to the previous power level. Compounding this is the game's tendency to crowd the screen with enemies and projectiles, especially these guys, screw these bastards, that are almost impossible to avoid or take out effectively because of the sluggish controls. And before you know it, you're back to the plain vanilla leather whip and struggling to hold your own in the levels. And that's to say nothing about the janky platforming, where you have to be hanging almost completely off the edge of platforms in order to just barely make a jump. Or an entire stage where you are constantly pursued by a wall of spikes where even one tiny mistake is an immediate death. Castlevania Adventure is an extremely short game. It's only 4 stages long, but it fights against you the entire way. It is wholeheartedly committed to not letting you finish the game. So with all this considered, when people talk about how terrible this game is and how much they hate it, I have to say, you guys are crazy. I actually really like Castlevania Adventure. No, it's not the best game, but it's pretty darn good. Yes, it's slow. Christopher Belmont just trudges through this game like he's wading through peanut butter. But it's also very brief, which means there isn't a whole lot of game here to trudge through. There isn't a whole lot of game here to learn. Besides, the slower pace almost works to your advantage sometimes, allowing you to take your time and prepare yourself for that pixel-perfect jump you have to make, or that enemy you have to strike or dodge at just the right moment. The enemies are strange, sure, but I think that gives Adventure its own identity, its own unique feel. The lack of staircases feels a bit off-brand, but realistically, stairs on the Game Boy screen would just take up too much room. Using ropes to move between screens and platforms was a perfectly reasonable concession to make. And on that note, regardless of how you feel about this game, you can't deny that Konami absolutely nailed it with the character size. Christopher Belmont's sprite is large enough to be unmistakable as a classic Castlevania protagonist, and yet small enough that it more or less mimics the character-to-screen ratio from the full console games. This in particular was a very tricky balance for developers to make. Very few of them ever really got it right. But Konami hit it out of the park pretty much right from the get-go. And speaking of hitting it out of the park, this game's soundtrack is one of the best you'll ever hear on the Game Boy. Damn, that's good stuff. I won't try to convince anyone that Castlevania Adventure is a great game, because obviously it's got its flaws. But if you're patient, and maybe more than a little bit forgiving, there's a perfectly enjoyable game here that is worth experiencing. and it also provided a solid foundation for its sequel, which built upon all of Adventure's best aspects and smoothed over all the rough edges. In short, for a Castlevania game without any skeletons, Castlevania Adventure still has some really good bones. And that's 3 more games down, and still many, many more to go. In the next episode, we'll look at 3 more games, but in the meantime, thank you for watching The Good, The Bad, and the Game Boy.